Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green, and this is a contextualized reading for Book 24 of Homer's Odyssey. Of course, this is the last book in the epic. It will not be my last lecture or talk on the subject. These contextualized readings have been for us to walk through the text in a closer way with the theme in mind, because of course these contextualized readings are for a course titled Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization. So since this is the last contextualized reading, just a couple of things to wrap up. So first of all, it is, I've been reading this text from this idea of what is Western civilization, the critiques that have manifested because of it, and its placement in the minds of would-be white supremacists, right? So I've been taking an anti-colonial critique of this. It's not to say that my reading is the only reading that can happen, of course, to the text. I'm just saying this for a broad audience, and there are so many details and so many ways. This is a text that has been read and reread and read and reread over and over and over again for centuries, right? So what really can a critique that I'm offering or do to this, and just this is just to say that this is not a my intention here is not to cancel Homer or something like that, but it is very much to look squarely in the face of history and the way that texts get used by certain people for certain rhetorical and ideological agendas. And definitely if there's a book that has been used that way, like outside of something like the Bible, maybe, it would be Homer's Odyssey. And so this has been hopefully helpful to folks. And if you are able to, I'm certainly not required, but if you are able to support us on Patreon, it would really be helpful. Just for as little as $1 a month, it can really help us continue on with this and other projects at the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. With that said, let's just dive into the last contextualized reading, and then I will follow up with some other lectures. But now when I do my other lectures, I can refer back to things, and if that's confusing to viewers, they can go back to these 24 contextualized reading lectures, and students as well, if you're students in my university courses. Okay. Peace is titled. And I want us to think about that, because like the surface level approach might be to be like, oh, there's been all of this bloodbath and warfare, and we're going to end finally in peace. And this, I don't think it's a very peaceful chapter when we think about it, or book as we call them. So we open with Hermes in this beautiful cosmological image of Hermes leading the suitors to the underworld. And wonderful similes as usual in this passage. But now Cyllenian Hermes called away the suitors' ghosts, holding firm in his hand the wand of fine pure gold that enchants the eyes of men whenever Hermes wants or wakes us from sleep. Are we waking from a kind of sleep? It's something we might ask. With a wave of this, he stirred and led them on, and the ghosts trailed after with high, thin cries, as bats cry in the depths of a dark, haunted cavern, shrilling, flittering, wild when one drops from the chain, slipped from the rock face while the rest cling tight. So with their high, thin cries, the ghosts flocked now, And Hermes the healer led them on, and down the dank mouldering paths, and past the ocean's streams they went, and past the white rock and the sun's western gates, and past the land of dreams. And they soon reached the fields of asphodel, where the dead, the burned out wraiths of mortals make their home. Beautiful imagery here, telling us a lot about Greek thought about afterlife. But past the land of dreams, that's like one of the places that it's not mentioned a lot. There's not a lot of elaboration in the land of dreams, but isn't this where Odysseus seems to have been, right? Back to the Phaeacians, if we think about them really quickly, and how the Phaeacians were able to just put Odysseus to sleep and put him in a boat and quickly ride over the waves. But the imagery there, if you remember that great simile from that moment in book around book 13, where the Phaeacians' ship literally becomes like horses over land going over water, that mixing of water and land imagery. And so then we get this final commentary from these other Greek heroic figures, which I think is just a really interesting way to wrap up this text. We see Achilles and Agamemnon who greet each other. Achilles says, "If only you had died your death in the full flush of the glory you had mastered, died on Trojan soil, then all united Achaea would have raised your tomb, and you'd have won your son great fame for years to come. Not so. You were fated to die a wretched death." And then Agamemnon recounts Achilles' death. "Son of Peleus, great godlike Achilles, happy man, you died on the fields of Troy, a world away from home, and the best of Trojan and Argive champions died around you, fighting for your corpse, And you, there you lay in the whirling dust, overpowered in all your power, and wiped from memory all your horsemen's skills. That whole day we fought. We'd never have stopped if Zeus had not stopped us with sudden gales. Then we bore you out of the fighting onto ships. We laid you down on the litter, cleansed your handsome flesh with warm water and soothing oils, and round your body troops of Danaans wept hot tears and cut their locks. Hearing the news, your mother, Thetis, rose from the sea, immortal sea nymphs in her wake, and a strange, unearthly cry came throbbing over the ocean. Terror gripped Achaea's armies. They would have leapt in panic, boarded the long, hollow ships, if one man, deep in his age-old wisdom, had not checked them, Nestor. From the first, his counsel has always seemed the best. And now, concerned for the ranks, he rose and shouted, "Hold fast, Argives, sons of Achaea, don't run now. This is Achilles' mother rising from the sea with all her immortal sea nymphs. She longs to join her son who died in battle." That stopped our panic forces in their tracks, as the old man of the sea's daughters gathered round you, wailing, heartsick, dressed you in ambrosial, deathless robes. And the muses, 9 in all, voice to voice in choirs, their vibrant music rising, raised your dirge. Not one soldier would you have seen dry-eyed. The muses' song so pierced us to the heart. For 17 days unbroken, and days and nights we mourned you, immortal gods and mortal men. At the 18th dawn we gave you to the flames and slaughtered around your body droves of fat sheep and shambling longhorn cattle, and you were burned in the garments of the gods and laved with soothing oils and honey running sweet, and a long cordage of Argive heroes paraded in review in battle armor, round your blazing pyre. Men in chariots, men on foot. A resounding roar went up, and once the god of fire had burned your corpse to ash. At first light we gathered your white bones, Achilles, cured them in strong neat wine and seasoned oils. Your mother gave us a gold two-handled urn, a gift from Dionysus, she said, a masterwork of the smith, the god of fire. Your white bones rest in that, my brilliant Achilles, mixed with the bones of the dead Patroclus and Menoetius' son, apart from those of Antilochus, whom you treasured more than all other comrades once Patroclus died. Over your bones we geared a grand noble tomb, devoted veterans all, Achaea's combat forces, high on its jutting headland over the Hellespont's broad reach, a landmark glimpsed from far out at sea by men of our own day and men of days to come. The building of monuments, right? And then your mother, begging the gods for priceless trophies, set them out in the ring for all our champions. You in your day have witnessed funeral games for many heroes, games to honor the death of kings, when young men cinched their belts, tense to win some prize. But if you'd laid eyes on these, it would have thrilled your heart. Magnificent trophies, the goddess, glistening-footed Thetis, held in your honor. You were dear to the gods, so even in death your name will never die. Great is your glory, Achilles, for all time in the eyes of all mankind. But I? What joy for me when the coil of war had wound down. For my return, Zeus hatched a pitiful death at the hands of Aegisthus and my accursed wife. So I read this all the way out just to give a sense of like why, first of all, to give a sense of how much detail and how much space Homer is willing to give in the final book of the Odyssey to the image of Achilles' death and funeral, right? Why is that there? We should ask that, right? Like, what is the importance of this long passage to the rest of the epic, which is about Odysseus? Now, we know very, very well, and we've heard from the beginning, this kind of contrast between Agamemnon and Odysseus, right? Because Agamemnon is a kind of foil to Odysseus, right? He's gone home. His wife had been corrupted by Aegisthus. Instead of creating a relationship with his son Orestes then had to kill his mother and take revenge for his father. But this sends Orestes on this like active line of slaying that eventually, because of he's killed his mother, the Furies are set upon him. His sister Electra then must kill him, even though she agrees that he needed to kill her father. So this cycle of familial violence that happens throughout that story, as an intertext here, is important. But why, why Achilles here at the end? Well, there's this sense, I think, that first of all, Achilles is dead, and so there's a sense there. There's this mention of the funeral games, which is a dispersal of treasure. And of course, if you've read the Iliad, that's a big part of the Iliad. But why with Odysseus here? I just want to leave that as an open question for a moment. And so they're exchanging this dialogue. Meanwhile, Hermes is bringing down these ghosts. As they exchange their stories, Hermes, the guide and giant killer, drew up close to both, leading the ghosts down the suitors King Odysseus killed. Struck at the sight, the two went up to them right away, and the ghost of Atreus' son Agamemnon recognized the noted prince Amphimedon, Melanius' daughter, or sorry, Melanius' dear son, uh, who received him once in Ithaca at his home, and Atrides goes called out to his friend. Now, Amphimedon, what disaster brings you down to the dark world, all of you? You know, you treated me well when I was in Ithaca. And Amphimedon's ghost calls back, I remember all of this. So, yes, I remember you coming to visit me, but we've been killed by Odysseus. Um, uh, um, uh, I remember it all, your majesty, as you say, and I will tell you, start to finish, the story of our death, the brutal and contrived to take us all. We were courting the wife of Odysseus, gone so long. Penelope's there. There's a recounting of her and the famous loom and how she was trying to stay away. And so, again, this is kind of a recapping moment. I think that we can look at this little portion of the text narratively as a device to like recap and as we're coming to the conclusion of the epic. Oh yes, there was all of this going on. This is what we suitors did, and we of course um, were revenged upon by Odysseus for our misdeeds. And so Agamemnon here then praises Penelope, right? And this is very interesting because we know, of course, you know, he's the foil in many ways to Odysseus. Around line 210, happy Odysseus, Agamemnon's ghost cried out, son of old Laertes, mastermind, with what a fine, faithful wife you won. What good sense resided in your Penelope. How well Icarius' daughter remembered you, Odysseus, the man she married once. The fame of her great virtue will never die. The immortal gods will lift a song for all mankind, a glorious song in praise of the self-possessed Penelope. A far cry from the daughter of Tyndareus, Clytemnestra. What outrage she committed, killing the man she married once. Yes, and the song man sing of her will ring with loathing. She brands with a foul name the breed of womankind, even the honest ones to come. So they traded stories, the two go standing there in the house of death, far in the hidden depths of the earth. And then we get a shift back to Laertes, right? So there, I think that there is definitely in Homer, the poets, you know, construction of the text, that there's the descent of people down to the underworld, and we get this balancing out, you know, with Agamemnon coming to the knowledge of Penelope and Odysseus, right? Still, why we needed the long description of Achilles' funeral, you know, I think that's still an open question that's worth pondering. Then we go back to Odysseus, who tests his father, and we get this image, and I think this is another one of those cinematic images that shows up throughout the text where you know, he comes upon his father who's doing his work in the garden. You know, he's digging, he's covered in dirt. He did find his father alone on that well-worked plot, spading round a sapling, clad in filthy rags, in a patched, unseemly shirt, and round his shins he had some oxhide leggings strapped, patched too, to keep from getting scraped, and gloves on his hands to fight against the thorns, and on his head he wore a goat-skin skull-cap to cultivate his misery that much more. Long enduring Odysseus, catching sight of him now, a man worn down with years, his heart racked with sorrow, halted under a branching pear tree, paused and wept. It is a touching image of the son coming upon his father. And then he decides, what am I going to do? Am I going to test him? And this is like classic Odysseus. And so he decides to go up and to test him and to ask him about his son. And the language that he uses, of course, this like idea that you can recognize somebody's slave-like qualities or not. Again, something to think about in Aristotle's Poetics if we were going to read that on a different occasion. There's nothing of slave about your build or bearing. I have eyes. You look like a king to me, he says to Laertes. Come now, tell me in no uncertain terms, whose slave are you? Whose orchard are you tending? And tell me this, I must be absolutely true. This place I have reached, is it truly Ithaca? And then he goes into a made-up story um, about um, about his trials and about how he was given 4 women, perfect beauties, skilled in crafts. Um, uh, uh, and then the father, Laertes, says, stranger, the land you've reached is the very one you're after, true, but it's in the grip of reckless, lawless men. And as for the gifts you showered on your guests, you gave them all for nothing. But if you'd found him here alive in Ithaca, um, Odysseus, right? You know, so this illusion. I once hosted this guy, Odysseus, and uh, if you'd found him alive, he would have been, lavished gifts on you. That unfortunate guest of yours, my son, there was a son, or was he all a dream? We see that language throughout the text. Uh, the most unlucky man alive, whom now I fear. And then he goes on and goes on, and he eventually, as Laertes tells the story, he comes to this overwhelming kind of grief, and Odysseus just can't take it anymore. And it's quite interesting, like, the kind of patience that he can have for grieving and deceiving Penelope, but he cannot stand to see his own father um, in his grief. And so at those words, a black cloud of grief came shrouding over Laertes, both hands clawing the ground for dirt and grime. He poured it over his grizzled head, sobbing in spasms, and Odysseus's heart shuddered, a sudden twinge shooting up through his nostrils, watching his dear father struggle. Like that great image of the tinge through the nostrils. Father, I am your son. And so he breaks this kind of, lying game that he's used to playing. And he tells his father, he shows him the scar, he tells the father of the suitor's death, and they go to a meal back at his father's house. Um, uh, Back in the house, facing his son, the wise old man tells him, if only Father Zeus, Athena, and Lord Apollo, if I were the man I was, king of the Cephallenians, when I sacked the city of Nericus, sturdy forces out on the jutting cape. If I'd been young in arms last night, or in our house with harness on my back, standing beside you, fighting off the suitors, how many I would have cut from the knees, cut the knees from under the heart inside. You would have leapt for joy. It's just relishing in the violence, the bloody carnage, right? And then we get the return of the servants, of Laertes' servants, and Dolius rushes up to him, recognizes him, says, dear master, you're back, the answer to our prayers. We lost all our hope, but the gods have brought you home. Welcome, health. This is the return of the king, a theme throughout literature, right? We get the return of the king. And it's not enough for him just to return to his queen and return to his palace, but he has to go to his father's estate, and he has to go back to this, to the ruggedness of the land and the trees that were planted for him when he was a child. In the meantime, here we go back from this image of the reunion and the meal back to the suitor families who've come to retrieve bodies here. So, as Homer tells it, rumor, the herald sped like wildfire throughout the city, crying out the news of the suitors' bloody death and doom, amassing from every quarter. As they listened, kinsmen milled with wails and moans of grief before Odysseus's palace, and then they carried out the bodies. Every family buried their own, and the dead from the other towns they loaded onto the rapid ships for crews to ferry back again, each to fetch his own home. Then, in a long mourning file, they moved to assembly, where once they'd grouped, crowding the meeting grounds. Old Lord Eupithes rose out in their midst and spoke out. Unforgettable sorrow wrung his heart. And then there's this question of rebellion and revenge, of course. And then Medon comes upon them. Suddenly Medon and the inspired bard approached them, fresh from Odysseus's house where they had just awakened. They strode into the crowds. Amazement took each man, but the herald Medon spoke in all his wisdom. Hear me, men of Ithaca. Not without the hand of the deathless gods did Odysseus do these things. Myself I saw the immortal fighting at his side, like mentor to the life. I saw the same god, now in front of Odysseus, spurring him on, now stampeding the suitors throughout the hall, crazed with fear and down with droves. And so from this, from saying like the gods helped Odysseus here, and it's also a way of saying that he's in the right, but the gods helped him win. And Halitherses then urges peace among the families and those loyal to the suitors. Some decide to follow Eupithes to attack, and others decide not to. Then we get a shift in the narrative back to Athena and Zeus, Mount Olympus. And Athena says, Father, son of Cronos, our high and mighty king, now let me ask you a question. Tell me the secrets hidden in your mind. Will you prolong the pain, the cruel fighting here, or hand down pacts of peace between both sides? My child, and look how this echoes the discussion between Poseidon and Zeus earlier on in the text, when Poseidon wants to have vengeance on the Phaeacians, right? Zeus says, my child, why do you pry and probe me so intently? Come now, wasn't the plan your own? I mean, and of course he'd said this to Athena way back in the beginning, so there's a kind of bookending going on here in the composition of the text. You conceived it yourself. Odysseus should return and pay the traitors back. Do as your heart desires, but let me tell you how it should be done. Now the royal Odysseus has taken his revenge. Let both sides seal their pacts that he shall reign for life, and let us purge their memories of the bloody slaughter of their brothers and their sons. Let them be friends devoted as in the old days. Let peace and wealth come cresting through the land. So Zeus decreed, and launched Athena, already poised for action. Down she swept from Olympion's craggy peaks. But then Odysseus's men had had their fill of hardy, or by then they'd had their fill of hardy fare, and the seasoned captain said, one of you go outside, see if they're closing in. They know that some of these people are going to come before them, and then Athena shows up again as mentor, taking the build and voice of mentor. Zeus's daughter Athena marches in. The good soldier Odysseus, thrilled to see her, turned to his son and said in haste, Telemachus, you'll learn soon enough as you move up to the fight, where the champions strive to prove themselves the best, not to disgrace your father's line a moment. In battle prowess we've excelled for ages all across the world. This kind of like rouses Telemachus's emotions. He's like, yeah, Now I'm fired up. Like, I won't disgrace you. um, and Laertes is ready to fight as well. And then we get the closing here. Goddess Athena rushed beside him, eyes ablaze. Son of Archesius, dear of all my comrades, say a prayer to the bright-eyed girl and Father Zeus. Then brandish your long spear and wing it fast. And Athena breathed enormous strength into the old man. He lifted a prayer to mighty Zeus's daughter, brandished his spear a moment, winged it fast, and hit Epithes, pierced his bronze-sided helmet that failed to block the bronze point, to tearing it through. Down Eupithes crashed, uh, his armor clanging against his chest. Odysseus and his gallant son charged straight at the front lines, slashing away their swords with two-edged spears, and now they would have killed them all, cut them from home, if Athena, daughter of storming Zeus, had not cried out in a piercing voice that stopped all the fighters cold. Hold back, you men of Ithaca, back from brutal war. Break off, shed no more blood. Make peace at once. So Athena commanded. Terror blanched their eyes. They went limp with fear. Weapons slipped from their hands and strewed the ground at the goddess's ringing voice. They spun in flight to the city, wild to save their lives, but loosing a savage cry, the long-enduring great Odysseus, gathering all his forces, swooped like a soaring eagle, just as the son of Cronus hurled a reeking bolt that fell at their feet. The mighty father's daughter and blazing-eyed Athena wheeled on Odysseus, crying, royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, master of exploits, hold back now. Call a halt to the great leveler, war. Don't court the rage of Zeus, who rules the world. So she commanded, he obeyed, glad at heart, and Athena handed down her pacts of peace between both sides for all the years to come. The daughter of Zeus, whose shield is storm and thunder, yes, but the goddess still kept Mentor's build and voice. The end. So, what a strange ending, right? A kind of anticlimactic ending for thinking about peace and the power of peace. Clearly the humans, the men, do not come to peace on their own. They come to peace out of fear of Athena and reverence for Athena. And so this deity is the thing that seems to unite what will become ancient Athens. After this, when in what becomes the so-called golden age of Greek literature and philosophy. I want to just touch back on, maybe one thing to think about with this moment of Achilles and the funeral games and the long description of his death. What it ends up in is in the war memorial. And this is definitely something that we see persistent in today's culture, in the United States especially. And we have battles over this, verbal battles, statues toppling, and in recent years. And the questions are all about how are we to preserve and think about memory and history. And there's a great Native American thinker, Mark Freeland, who importantly often points out that the differences between memory and history as well. But those statues, and like our literature, and like much of anything that is created at our hands, whether it be the textbooks of history or the texts of that we might study literarily, poetic texts, fiction, epic, there is an aesthetic component to it. Aesthetic means it's something that we see, it's of the senses, right? And so when we're talking about critical theory and literary theory and these aspects in the ways that they might relate to politics or a discussion of Western civilization, it is really a discussion about aesthetics and memory and how we are going to give a narrative to ourselves, and definitely Anglo, those who have held up throughout recent centuries the idea of a kind of Anglo-Saxon cause, a white supremacist cause, well into the 20th century in the United States and into the 21st century in definitely far-right extremist forms. Their ideas of white supremacy. And they will use, as I've said over and over again, the rhetoric of appeals to this thing called Western civilization. And there's a broad enough sort of spectrum between those who we might call on the maybe the far right, who are overt, white supremacists, and those who are more moderate but might not be thinking so much in terms of, well, they might think that they're just like kind of all lives matter people or something like that, right? They might not see how white supremacy is infused in the values of the things that they proclaim, like Western civilization, for example. And so it causes, because there's so much ambiguity and gray area in terms of the representation and aesthetics, it causes all sorts of ongoing discussion and debate. In the United States, we don't have a robust discussion about aesthetics, right? We don't learn that much about it. We might learn or have to read a text like the Odyssey in high school, which is one of the reasons why I've used it here. But in political discourse, although political discourse is always aestheticized in the United States, we do not have a rigorous intellectual analysis of the politicized aesthetics that we see in the country, whether we call them left, far left, right, center, whatever. We don't talk about them as aesthetics. And I think that lack of discussion around aestheticization of politics is a current problem. It feeds into our inability to interact with each other. Of course, the great critical theorist Walter Benjamin called fascism the aestheticization of politics. And there's plenty to be said about that, maybe in a different lecture. But I am going to say that political discourse in general, just like historical discourse, is oftentimes a matter of aesthetics. And what we see in memorials, what we see in this discussion around statues and memory and history, is a discussion about the aestheticization of glory. And Giorgio Agamben is one of many current theorists. He's an aestheticist who, from Italy, who talks about the aesthetics of glory and how that's transferred over in our political, not just discourse, but in our political ceremony. So what we've seen recently in the attacks on Congress on January 6th of 2021, for example, we saw we see not only is it a violent attack, but it's staged in an aesthetic way. It's all on stage. It's all on camera. People have their signs of collapsing Jesus and Donald Trump together, for example. There's an aesthetics to it as well, and they are fueled in their rage. The people who attacked the Capitol, they're fueled by these ideas that are very aestheticized, ideas that have roused emotions and that make them feel like that they're not being heard, and they then storm the Capitol, and into the year 2022 when I'm making this video as well, with because the far right has implemented a way to stoked the rage at the Capitol last year. All of our security forces are now more heightened this year, so that when the Supreme Court recently revoked Roe versus Wade, for example. People go out to protest, and now there are snipers on the Supreme Court, right? So this is an intention, I think, on the far right to militarize, to stoke the flames of ire between different political groups, to harden hearts, to create battle lines between so-called metaphors of right and left that go back to the French Revolution, but that are collapsing in all sorts of ways. So that now people who do what would be maybe more peaceful protest can be caught on surveillance cameras and be treated as terrorists, right? So this is all part of a shift towards the globe. It's global in nature. It's not just the United States. It's been happening for more than half a century now. That is keeps ratcheting things more and more to the right. And this is a difficult position and place to be in, and the people who want stability and maybe are not far right extremists, I think, look to things like the ideas of Western civilization, to values of freedom, democracy, things like that are embedded in the Greek tradition. But I think from an anti-colonial perspective alone, and from a perspective that doesn't really see the future use of a hard divide between right and left anymore, because so much of it gets mixed in what I've called in different instances a political theological vortex, where things that used to be left are now seen as right and vice versa. Discursively, in the midst of that, people throw out blanket charges of fascism without really understanding the history of fascism and how it works. Yes, there are those impulses out there, and they are strong right now. But it's not enough to me to just label that someone as fascist and go on with that. We need to understand what is wrong about fascism and where, particularly in someone's rhetoric, that fascism arises. Because if you think about the term really briefly, in Italy in the 1920s, which is where it comes from politically, it starts showing up in the late 19th century, but it really begins in terms of the political categories of the idea of a bundle of sticks that's stronger together rather than the one that can be broken. So a bundle, that's where the populist element of the image of the fascist image is together. There's this kind of strength. And so populism and fascism sort of meet in that trajectory towards pushing some sort of like authoritarian leader or dictator, right, that can then make decisions for everybody, that can speak the will of the people, right? And that's what we got in someone, in these figures like Mussolini in Italy, and then Hitler, of course, in Germany in the last century. And we are facing a moment in current politics and in current global crises where decisions are being made that are more and more increasingly anti-democratic. And even where we have the will of a good portion of the American populace today on the right, we have a political will to push people into power that are strong deciders. So there's an authoritarian impulse that's going on in American politics that is always going to be anti-democratic, but is playing on populism itself. And so what is at stake here, if you do value democracy or that element of Western civilization, it becomes questions about who is included, who gets to be part of the citizenship body, who gets to be part of the polis, for example, whose votes get to count. And in the broadening of voices of whose bodies and get to count in the United States, there was a broadening from previously marginalized populations, whether it be women, whether it be people of color, some who had the right to vote foisted onto them if they're Native Americans, for example. But in the 20th century, there was a great broadening of that and voting rights acts in the 1960s that are now being attempted to, there are attempts to revoke, reduce, and control who and where has the ability to vote in a democracy. And so those impulses are coming from, especially from the far right and from white supremacists who want to maintain a particular control over other people. And by appealing to the old aesthetics of the ancient world, they embed violence, the aestheticization of violence, glory of military, glory of monuments, those kinds of impulses. But that is not at all to say, to cast Homer as a white man is an absurdity, right? It doesn't exist. That idea doesn't exist historically. He's a Greek Mediterranean dude with like dark skin, and we know that even as little as a century ago, and on the streets of the town where I live in Denver, Colorado, the Italian people were not considered white, right? And so what, the aesthetics of this notion, this thing called race, they shift over time, but the idea of whiteness in its modern period, as I've covered in another lecture, arose from the political theological ambitions of Europeans who sought to conquer the two hemispheres that we now call the Americans, the Western hemispheres of the world. You cannot divorce religion, specifically Christianity, right, in both its Catholic and Protestant forms, from the impulses of the papal bulls of the late 1400s and their developments and rearticulation into law after the Protestant Revolution, the Protestant Reformation. And so the impact that has, particularly on England. And within England, there are various impulses that fracture more extremist groups like the Puritans who are not happy enough. They're not happy with the Anglican Church and need to push on. And they push on over towards the West, and they embrace an idea of what they call Anglo-Saxon purity that they will trace back to before the French invasion or the so-called Norman yoke. They'll trace it back to figures like King Arthur, but also King Arthur's like a kind of legendary figure, or King Brutus, but then also real historical figures like King Alfred. And they will then claim, as they claim their Anglo-Saxon superiority over native people here, and of course over African slaves, they're also claiming their superiority over the Anglican Church at the time period, and over of course the Catholic Church, papalism in general. And so we get a more virulent form of white supremacy that exists in the United States. Although the same political theological forces of domination and the color code system of white, meaning white European supremacy, are embedded in the papal bulls and the forcing of Christianity onto native people in the Caribbean, in South America, in Africa, and so forth. So we need to look at those ambitions to power and how they're embedded in newer forms of religious ideologies that did not exist with Homer. But we know that in English folk culture from Geoffrey of Monmouth onward, and I'll cover this again, in detail in another lecture, but that those folk impulses create a nationalist fantasy for the idea of a race of Anglo-Saxons who are the superior conquerors, who have melded to a certain extent with the Bretons, the Britons, the Celts, to create this superior race, that this language of Anglo-Saxon superiority is definitely used by the founding fathers of the United States. Definitely, Thomas Jefferson refers to the Norman yoke, for example. And so they are imagining themselves in this kind of fictive, legendary relationship all the way going back to Troy. And so the way that this book and texts like it have been aestheticized, is the ways that they have been embedded in curriculum for centuries and centuries, particularly through English education, and then, later, into forms of American education as well, and particularly that extremist Puritan, not just the Puritans. Like, I don't mean to just say that it's just, like, you might say, like, oh, you're overstating the Puritan influence on this idea of the United States. I think that there's a lot to be said there, but this isn't an American literature course right now. There's an impulse, like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, to only focus on this one little group of people and gauge their impact on the United States today. But definitely the figures like Jefferson, whose impact is clear. The Declaration of Independence, the writing of the Constitution, initial laws in the United States. He's cousins with John Marshall, who writes the Johnson v. McIntosh case. These are very much documents that are, revered and held sacred, especially by people on the right wing. Who might not think of themselves as white supremacists, but who might be upholding implicitly white supremacy. And then those who might, behind closed doors, be like, yes, we are superior. We're the better governors of things. We need to hold down civilization because the rest of these people can't do it. Those are discussions that unfortunately persists today. They persist very much so by people who have lots of power. And so what we need to sort of track historically and maybe differentiate is this sort of idea of Anglo-Saxon purity, race, right? Which is very much a modern invention, or a modern elaboration that draws on people who are historically wrong, Geoffrey of Monmouth, or the poet for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, who's in the opening, lines of that poem, traces British history back to Brutus, who is a supposed refugee of the Trojan War. So there's this attempt to read lineage into this notion of Western civilization early on, right? But it's through aesthetics. It's not through real historical sort of contact, and it has to do with the influence more of Rome on monks like Geoffrey of Monmouth. So it has to do more with actually embedded Christianity and the attempt to claim Rome as they are colonizing, and the pagans who exist on the island of England at the times too, right? So there's this fusion of Viking and Anglo-Saxon purity, the viciousness of their ability to conquer that's tempered with their ability to rule effectively, that merges into this more recent fantasy of Anglo-Saxon superiority. And we need to unpack that logic. We need to unpack the aesthetics of that logic, because sometimes people can refer without thinking about it or uncritically to something as being culturally important, but without understanding how the aesthetics around that continue to support something like white supremacy, which is something that I'm just flat out against. And so I'm not claiming to be neutral or objective or anything like that in these lectures. I am not for white supremacy. So there you go. I'm anti-colonialist. There you go. Are there other ways to read the Odyssey to support that stuff? Yes, there are, and people do it all the time. But that has not been my goal in this course this summer or these lectures, which isn't to say that I have been able to exhaust the book at all. I will continue more in the nuances of reception to Odysseus and the Odyssey and Homer in general, and more recent discussion in critical theory. But we needed to get the text and a reading of the text out. My attention over 24 books of contextualized reading to the text itself should say something about me. It should say something to me about, it should say at least that I'm not calling for the idea of just sort of canceling Homer or forgetting Homer or burning Homer's books or whatever that kind of impulse might be at all. It is not about necessarily like a quote erasing history. It is about looking at aesthetics and history as both productions, efforts of human production to establish forms of memory, and to face that in what we see as like an ongoing attempt to get better at understanding what happens historically and look at it square in the face and all of its violence, right? It doesn't come from denying it or from just privileging the so-called winners of history, but it also doesn't do well to valorize the aesthetics of the violence, which may be very wrong historically. What I mean by that, for example, is that we see from archaeology and anthropology that in sites even in England, for example, in southeastern England, that where the original Angles and Saxons who had come from the European continent, the traditional story has been they invaded and they conquered, and that the historical evidence for that narrative, that it was just like a conquest, doesn't necessarily hold up. But because the historical narrative was that they were conquerors, the people who did come to what is now the United States, to Turtle Island / North America, because they came with that fantasy that their blood was conquerors' blood, and that they inherently have the better right through blood to rule and govern other people, because they told themselves that fantasy, because they told themselves that Christianity was the highest form of civilized religion. Even if when they came to start recognizing other religions, they named them other religions, with the intent of stating that Christianity was implicitly the most rational and the highest ordered and the most civilized. And those formations embed themselves into the rhetoric of Western civilization alongside the aesthetics that valorize Viking culture, Anglo-Saxon conquest, those sorts of things. And so when we see TV shows that valorize Vikings, that valorize Nordic cultures, it's not to say that this stuff is not interesting mythologically and all, but there's a way that it has been used to also reinforce the aesthetics of white supremacy at the same time, while calling itself like an embracing of its pagan roots, right? So we get the QAnon shaman, the images around that kind of figure. The aesthetics that go into that can even claim a sort of weird indigeneity to themselves, even as they promote the active genocide of existing indigenous peoples and populations that are on the continent today, who are the descendants of the much greater amount of Native American peoples who've were genocided throughout several different waves of fractal genocide, as Barbara Alice Mann calls it. A great thinker and writer, Barbara Alice Mann from Seneca Onondaga woman. I will stop there for this contextualized reading and pick up more. I've kind of gone on here to entice you into thinking about this more, and hopefully you'll watch now the future lectures that I make there, digging into the ideas and the aesthetics around this. Thank you, as always, for your attention, for your listening. If you're listening in podcast form, support us on Patreon if you can, if you are able, and have a great day, evening, morning, wherever and whenever you are. Bye.